welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today on the show, we have Maria Michaelis. She's a pediatric anesthesiologist and a Kevin MD contributor. She wrote 2 articles recently for my site. The first, Closed Loop Communications, Good for Codes and Good for Marriage. And second, Can Patients See My Smile Behind All This PPE? So first off, tell me your story and your journey to where you are today.
Well, I'm a practicing anesthesiologist, and like you mentioned, I do pediatric anesthesia about 50% of the time, and then general anesthesia the other 50%. We're in an urban practice center where we do a mixed caseload, and I've been practicing for 15 years post-residency. I did my residency at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and then came back to practice here, which is my home state of Nebraska, and I think it's one of the best kept secrets in the Midwest is living in the Midwest, in Omaha specifically. I like it here. I've got 3 kids that I had 1 during residency, 2 afterwards. So kind of that multitasking mom and trying to figure out how to balance it all, which it's not possible, I figured out. So, and then I started doing pediatric anesthesia about 6 years ago when our practice asked for a few volunteers to get board certified in pediatric anesthesia. And I decided that was an interest I had. So I've been doing about 50% of kids for the last 6 years.
Wonderful. And how has the pandemic affected you and your practice so far?
Well, as everybody would say, it's changed everything dramatically. We've had to implement at the beginning of this intubation and extubation teams before we had universal testing. Now luckily, our hospital has universal testing for every operative patient, and now every admission gets tested. So we know what we're dealing with going in, and there's no longer a need for the intubation and extubation team. During that first month or 6 weeks when we had the intubation and extubation team, we weren't able to do full caseloads. We were just doing emergent, urgent type of cases. They had a staging system that our hospital implemented, and we'd only do those cases. And it was very tedious because you would be assigned to the intubation team, extubation team for the day, and all you would do is go from room to room to room, not meeting anyone ahead of time until you got in there with your full, we call them the papper, the full get up on. And so they really couldn't see you, and you barely could hear you. And you're all of a sudden saying, okay, trust me to intubate you. So we'd sit there for 10 minutes afterwards, or 15, until the air recirculated in our operating room while we wiped everything down and stayed with the patient and monitored the patient. And then everybody could come back in. And then we'd come back and do it all over for extubation. So it took a lot of coordinating to know which rooms to go to. And it just took personal touch of anesthesia out for me. And it was not my favorite thing to do, but it was a necessary thing at the time. But like I said, I'm so glad that we now have universal testing and things are getting back to my old style of practice, which I enjoy.
And if there's something that you know now that you wish you knew before the pandemic started, what would that be?
Oh, I would say how important it is to have those interactions in pre-op. I mean, for me anyway, and I'm sure other physicians in different specialties know that meeting your patient and having that whole ability to have a conversation with full eye contact and expressions is important. And I didn't realize how important it was until I was wearing a mask every day, which we still are at our facility, and I'm sure we will for quite some time have the universal masking. But I've tried to convey more things with my voice tone and just talking things through a little bit more with patients. And then I do kind of utilize a brief time with your mask down while we do our airway exam to kind of, ease their fears and let them see my face too. But yeah, I think at the beginning of this, it would have been nice to know how important that really is.
Sure.
But you know how it is when things are taken away, then you appreciate them.
Absolutely. So you wrote a Kevin MD article, Closed Loop Communications, Good for Codes and Good for Marriage. And I know that during the pandemic, a lot of families, they're going through stressful times right now. So tell me the story behind that article and why you decided to write it.
Sure. Well, my husband Mark, and I have 3 daughters. And as you know, because I know you have children too, we are always going 4 different directions with work and kids, driving them here to there. And we miss things so much in the last 5 years where one kid wouldn't have a bag, one kid wouldn't get picked up. I would be at work late and my husband wouldn't know. And I'd say, no, I told you that. and he wouldn't remember. So we thought, okay, when I do codes at work, this stuff doesn't get dropped because you repeat back to me what you say. So I talked to him about closed loop communication. He's not a medical person. So I just kind of told him the basics of it. And he latched onto it right away because he's kind of a no nonsense, black and white type of individual. So we started doing the closed loop where even if it was on text message, it would be, you'd have to repeat it back and say it in your own words. What you understood is who's getting who's going to take this to there. And we found out we had a lot less misunderstandings and frankly, a lot less fighting because we would bicker about who made the mistake. You always kind of want to place the blame on your spouse, and we'd fight about that. And with this closed loop communication, it cut down on our bickering and it made things more pleasant for our communications. And then we also at night, I didn't put this in the article, I don't think, but we implemented a 20-minute sit down time when our 3 kids are in bed, and we talk about the next day and if there's questions, concerns, or anything. And that's kind of what they do in the debrief on codes as well. So it helped our marriage, and especially in this pandemic time, when we were in close quarters, we found that our communication skills being at optimal levels cut down on bickering. Not to say that, we didn't get on each other's nerves, because we did, because he wasn't used to me being around as much, and vice versa. And our kids were there doing classes in different rooms. And so, but it did help that we had some of this communication things that we had figured out ahead of time. Yeah.
That's funny that whatever we learned in medicine and medical training kind of seeps into our family life. I have 2 young daughters as well. My oldest is a freshman in high school, and one of the things that I implement is the sign-out list, just like we do during change of shifts. And whenever she's about to start her homework, we always kind of run the list. And whenever she's finished, we always run the list to kind of make sure that everything gets done. So it's funny that how our training kind of seeps into what we do every day.
Right. And our kids aren't always on board with it, but once they figure out that it's helpful, we try to get them that way. And what I did find out is the girls, our 3 girls, were really appreciative of having that communication and not getting left at places, knowing who was going to pick them up ahead of time, and then just knowing that we weren't going to drop the ball. But now we have a new thing, is that our 16-year-old is learning to drive, our oldest. So we're going to try to incorporate that into our communication. And I think that she's going to be a part of our closed loop communication debriefs at night.
So during the pandemic, a lot of us are staying in, the kids are staying in, they're learning from home. There's a lot of family times, and that can certainly increase the stress in any family. So do you have any advice or anything that you've learned over the past few months that you would want to share with my audience?
Well, I found out that we have 3 daughters with 3 different personalities. I'm sure your daughters have different personalities. And so different things would work for them. Our middle daughter needed time alone. And that's kind of like if I'm getting irritated by everything, I just needed time alone. So there was times that I would just go sit in my master closet. She would go sit in her room, just take a time apart. And then my oldest and my youngest, they just like to have music playing. So they would go into their own area and play music. But we did notice that we each had to kind of recognize that we were on each other's nerves for whatever reason and try to just separate yourself from it, whether that's even going on a walk. My husband would spend some time in the garage when he got irritated. But yeah, I think it's important to be cognizant of your own feelings. And when you're starting to get irritated about close proximity of siblings or spouse, that you take some time and just try not to offend them and say, I just need a little alone time really right now.
Now, over the past few months, has anything surprised you about yourself or your relationship with your family?
I found out that, like I said, we had some good communication backbone. There was things that we can improve on. Our middle daughter, especially, who is pre-adolescent, was going through some of those mood changes, and it was helpful for her to vocalize her issues to us. And then also we started having her see just a counselor to voice, because she was having only us around. She didn't have her friends around anymore. She didn't have her grandparents or anybody else to talk to. It was just her dad, or her dad and I and her siblings. So we did Zoom calls with a counselor once a month for her, just to have a third party that she could go and talk to somebody without us eavesdropping and being around. And that helped her immensely. So I would say like I said, everybody's a little different with their personalities, and you need to kind of see what works for your own personality. So I did learn that everybody's a little different even in our own household.
Sure. So let's take a step back. Tell me something that you've been curious about, or something that you've been passionate about recently.
I would say that figuring out your niche, like trying to figure out where you fit in after 15 years in practice, and especially with this pandemic, we've had a lot of downtime, and our department at least has given us some time at home to think about academic endeavors and I was thinking about all the things that I've done through the years. And the one thing that I've done in the last couple of years is become involved in our Nebraska Board of Medicine and Surgery. I'm on the licensure committee who hears complaints about other physicians in our state. And I become more passionate about that and even decided to be on the national committee. And I'm starting on the low rung. I'm just on the editorial committee. But I thought that would be a good opportunity to move my way up. But that's where I feel like my passion has led me, is to licensure and to board certification, things like that. But 5 years ago, I would have said 3 different things. It's just that you have to try different things to see what really interests you. And I don't think you should be ashamed to say, well, 10 years ago, I was really interested in this, but now I have 0 interest in that, because that's part of life. Variety is the spice of life. So, but I'd say right now I'm really interested in my position in the Nebraska Board of Medicine and Surgery and just licensure issues and board certification.
Sure. We're talking to Maria Michaelis. She's a pediatric anesthesiologist. She wrote a Kevin MD article, Closed Loop Communications, Good for Codes and Good for Marriage. Maria, what's your take-home message for the Kevin MD audience?
Well, and I think this is probably one that's been universal right now, but especially in our house, is just to be kind to each other and not to try to tear anyone down right now. It's just my middle daughter, again, is getting on the cusp of social media, and she was distressed last night about a post that she had put up on social media that had a negative comment to it. And I listed all these positives that were listed with it, all these positive comments, but it was the one negative one that stuck out. And I think that's the way human nature is. You're 10 compliments to 1 complaint, and you're always going to remember that one negative comment. And so it's important to really think about what you're saying, especially on social media, and to others in this time. Have some compassion and empathy, and try to keep the positive comments coming, and maybe the negative ones really weigh whether they're necessary to help anything, So I think that's what I told her last night, and that's my take home right now. Be empathetic and compassionate with others.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories, insight, and wisdom. Maria, thank you for being on the show.
Sure. Thank you, Kevin.